Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author but also director of the centre, and I'm joined today by a friend of our endeavours here, Jacob Rennaker. So Jacob, tell us where you're speaking to us from.
I'm coming to you now from Seattle, Washington, in the United States, and just moved here, relocated from Los Angeles area. So, little change of scenery. It's from what I can tell so far. It's a little bit closer to Tolkien's environs than kind of the more desert-like at times and quite congested Los Angeles area.
So you basically moved from Harad, and you're now somewhere a bit more like Bree or the Shire,
Right.
or even a bit further north. So Jacob, you've also shifted role a bit. You were telling me that you're now working in fantasy in a different way.
Yes. So from an academic kind of examination of fantasy, still continuing that on the side, but now in my primary role is helping to develop and produce fantasy games, board games, etc. So
That's very exciting. Fantastic job. Both of us are keen Tolkien fans and readers with a little bit of expertise. And the subject of today's podcast is the Silmarillion. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. The most important of which is that we're about to start a readathon where we invite all of you out there who have read it before and want to talk about it with others, or would like to try it for a first time, to take on a chapter and share your thoughts on that chapter with everybody who's following the journey. We did a successful readathon on the Lord of the Rings in the spring, put this out to public vote. I think the choices were The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, or one of the Narnia books. And The Silmarillion pipped The Hobbit at the post. And I'm actually very proud of the choice because it means we're really kind of going to tackle the harder stuff. So if you have thought of reading The Silmarillion or tried it and failed, hopefully the conversation that Jacob and I will be having will ease you into reading it again. So first of all, here's an easy ball, Jacob. What is the Silmarillion? What's it all about? If you've just put down Lord of the Rings, what happens when you pick up the Silmarillion?
Well, it depends. If you've just finished Lord of the Rings and you pick up the Silmarillion expecting it to be a lot more of the same, it's really it's quite different. There's similarities. There's a lot of intersection there. But I guess the place to probably start, and before you cracking open the Silmarillion, if you haven't before, one of the most important things to understand is kind of contextually what the Silmarillion is, and that is a series of stories. It's not a series of stories, it's a collection really of stories that kind of flesh out Tolkien's secondary world, what you might hear referred to as the legendarium, or Middle Earth sometimes is, but that's technically doesn't quite cover everything that's in the Silmarillion, because there's a lot more outside of that. But essentially, if you're just coming from Lord of the Rings, this is essentially all the stories from which the Lord of the Rings emerged, and they weren't created in kind of a chronological, systematic way. This was really kind of an organic kind of springing forth of ideas that Tolkien had started starting in about the 1910s or so, where he starts kind of putting these down to pen to paper until his death in 1973. He's continuing to kind of, I like to think of the Silmarillion, his work that becomes kind of codified in the Silmarillion as kind of a garden, right? Where he has all these different ideas and he's pruning and he's going back, and sometimes he's pulling them out and putting in something new that's kind of close to it. But it's this kind of ever evolving. He was never completely finished with it. He was tinkering up till the very end. And so you have all of these different stories. Some of them are well developed. Others are just kind of simple sketches. Some are kind of philosophical essays on different ideas within there. But what happened was, how we have the book as it is right now is it was something that Tolkien tried publishing earlier, before Lord of the Rings, right? So this is things that he was working on after the Hobbit was published, and to great enthusiasm from the audience, the publisher asked for more, and so he had all of these stories that he'd been tending to, that were kind of these background stories of right, of his legendarium, this world that he's created, a secondary world, and he handed the publishers a few chapters of this, and they said, nope, like that's this is not the Hobbit. We want more Hobbit. And so what he ended up doing was kind of striking what I feel is kind of a middle ground between this kind of like larger, more epic history of an entire world universe, in essence, and the adventure, fast-paced story, with a lot of dialogue in The Hobbit, and that's where Lord of the Rings kind of grows out of there. But so Lord of the Rings gets published, and then people are clamoring for more Tolkien. Tolkien passes away, and so his son Christopher is left with the publisher saying, like, hey, we know that he was working on things, get us some more of that. We want more, everyone wants more. And so Christopher has to file through all of these different stories in different stages of completion, put them together, create some sort of kind of coherent narrative arc from them, and flesh them out, really. And so he does so, pouring through the materials himself. He has help from fantasy author Guy Gavriel Kay, who helps kind of create some kind of connective narrative threads between these stories that Tolkien hadn't sat down and kind of put everything out in one go. And so it ends up, and apparently Christopher was under a lot of pressure to get this done quickly, so he puts it together, gets it good enough, and then ships it off. And that's what you have in your hands, is this kind of posthumous collection of larger stories in varying degrees of completion that Tolkien had about this, this world that he created.
Yes, and as people are probably aware, there are other follow-on papers that Christopher Tolkien edited. I think it's fair to say that the Silmarillion feels more polished and more complete than some of them. So you would be getting a satisfying read if you read the Silmarillion. It's not quite as unfinished as the Unfinished Tales, for example, as the name suggests. So that's the sort of the history of how it came to be written. It was definitely really what Tolkien loved. I think this is what thing to understand is it's the fertile material, as you said, it's the soil out of which his garden grew. So here I've got, actually, it's a first edition of the Silmarillion, and looking at the table of contents here, you see that it's basically in it's in 4 bits, really. Forgive me for my pronunciation, but the first one is the Ainun Lindale, which is a sort of creation setting up story. The Vala Quenta, which is the story of the Valar, who are the sort of gods and goddesses of this world. And that goes into the Quinta Silmarillion, which is like what gives the book its name. So that's all takes part in the first age of Tolkien's world. It's the one which we probably spend most time talking about, I think, today. Then I'd say the last half or last third is split into 2 bits. The next thing is called the Akalabeth. Don't get scared off by these titles. They're just titles. Basically, that's the subtitle of that is The Downfall of Numenor. That takes place in the Second Age, and we'll spend some time talking about that because this is Rings of Power territory. And then the last section is called, helpfully, of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. And that is partly in the Second Age and obviously partly in the Third Age. So that's the table of contents. But do you want to sketch out in a little bit more detail? Let's start with the form of creation that we read about, what's going on there. We all know the biblical versions of creation. What is Tolkien's sort of myth of creation that he uses?
Yeah, and this is fascinating. So what really hooked me was the very beginning part, because of my academic area of expertise in kind of world historical mythologies, belief traditions, stories, tales that connect with gods, monsters, etc. So the first section, this Ainulindale, literally
There you are.
means
That's how you say it. Aina Lindale. Thank you.
Ainulindale. So literally it means the music of the Ainur. So whereas you have, for those readers familiar with the Hebrew Bible or Christian Old Testament, Genesis, first chapter, you have kind of God speaking, kind of commanding the world into existence in different stages. And different worlds, different world areas, cultures have different myths, cosmogonic myths, which means like the creation of the cosmos or the ordered world around us. So Tolkien is the name of this, Ainulindale, the music of the Ainur. His kind of overriding metaphor for creation is music, is song, right? So you have a few different characters. You have Iluvatar, who is this kind of primary large deity, that's kind of could be equated with the kind of Judeo-Christian God, in some ways. But again, making equivalence is something that I want to get to when we get to the Vala Quinta, talking about a little bit, and Tolkien's pantheon. But it's this kind of the primary main, all-powerful, all-knowing deity that's behind it. And this Iluvatar, and again, like Julia said, don't let the names throw you off. So that's one of the things that might trip readers up, is running into these names that are so foreign and you're not used to seeing in Lord of the Rings or Hobbit or anywhere else in the world, for that matter. So these words, the more that you hear them, it's good to reference charts. There's plenty online that people have kind of helpfully put together lists of gods, lists of genealogies, relationships between these different characters. So absolutely don't feel, there's one thing that I would like to get to new readers, is you're not alone in reading this. There's a number of people who are also reading this, and people who have provided helps and different things. So toward the end of our conversation, I think we'll go through some of the resources that would be helpful. But this is just kind of try to whet your appetite, give you a kind of 30,000 foot view of what we're looking at. So again, Ainulindale, all-powerful God, then commands, brings forth these kind of minor deities, beings of power, who are themselves, he brings it, this all-powerful God brings them to create with him, and they do so through song. And each of them sings something. This Iluvatar, this God, kind of he proposes a theme, a musical theme, and the different individual powerful beings that he created kind of each riff on that in their own way.
And it's kind of jazz,
it's jazz,
isn't it?
Yeah, right. And then
the world
they
is
just kind of
created
like
by jazz.
It really is, yeah. And so and that's what happens, and they're kind of working together, figuring out how to work together and play off of one another. And then one of these beings of power kind of wants a solo all the time, and so just kind of goes louder and louder and kind of throws off the others, and kind of throws everything into chaos. And then the Ainulindale is a story of how the group and this god deal with this commotion, that's kind of destructive, chaotic participation of one of these in different rounds, and then ultimately what they sing, the god has them create into being. So that's kind of like initial like blueprint outline of everything that's happening, and then they go in and the world is created and they kind of recapitulate this song into reality. Is this something that's happening?
So there's some wonderful things I just want to pick out of that. So Melkor, who also gets known later, he's renamed Morgoth by one of the elves, but he's the
Feanor, who we'll get to a lot.
He is the one who wants to sing his own song. And we were having a chat before we started talking about how this is described as him ending up sounding just like brass instruments. So for those of you who are wanting to find connections to Lord of the Rings films that they love, please note that Howard Shore has read the Silmarillion because or intuited it, because all of his ways of characterizing the evil side is to use a lot of brass, which is entirely appropriate. The other thing about it is how beautifully it reads. Now, it's got a wonderful poetry to it, but it's also got lots of surprises. It's like there's waves of creation. Imagine it like waves on the shore, sort of again and again. With Ilúvatar saying, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but he says to Melkor and the others, anything you've done here can't be outside my plan, and which is very interesting philosophically about the nature of evil. This is really, if you're interested in philosophy, this is a fascinating book for you. And then the final thing is actually when he then shows them the world, he actually says it's not happened yet. Creation hasn't happened. So they decide, some of those who've been in part of the scene decide to go in to the world to create the world they've already sung about. Fascinating perspective on time, and we could mention Boethius and other people here if we wanted, but the idea of where does eternal time fit within a sort of temporal world. Anyway, maybe that's another podcast. So they have to go in and create it, and there's a little bit that says how many eons pass before the elves arrive, of the waves of creation by the good guys, and then Melkor coming and spoiling it, which is a way of Tolkien accounting, I think, for the very long history of our world before there's any of us here to see it. He does give a sort of scientifically, if you're putting it along science, it kind of fits quite well, because he suggests this is a much longer period, but we're only going to concentrate on the bit where there are elves and men and dwarves and so on to see it. So I think it's rather beautifully written. It's a wonderful myth, a wonderful metaphor for creation.
Yeah, I've certainly canonized it myself in my own devotional. It is like you said, it's poetic, it's beautiful, it's moving, it's inspiring, and I return to it fairly often. Probably more often than I do the rest of the Silmarillion, to be quite frank, again, because of my just like love for myth and kind of like creation stories. But that's one that just I keep finding myself coming back to, and it's not terribly long.
No, exactly. You took the words out of my mouth. I was about to say, I wouldn't advise sitting down and trying to read the Silmarillion like a story. I'd read it in bits, and if you just felt, oh, I feel like something mythic today, go to the beginning and read that chapter. Just to sort of, if you're a student out there, you might want to compare it to the beginning of Paradise Lost, because there are very strong parallels between the way Milton sets up his world in Paradise Lost and this. So you can chuck it into your essay or just for a general interest, because of course Tolkien would have been fully aware of what Milton was up to and his philosophical underpinning. So he's also, as well as the Bible, he's definitely in conversation with Milton. And of course, moving slightly on, he's also in conversation with the Norse pantheon. So let's have a look at the next section, which is, we don't need to spend very long on. It's a little description of the Valar and the Maiar. Now, if you've wondered who Gandalf is and what a Balrog is and where does Sauron fit in the grand scheme of things, this is a wonderful short section for you to read. So, Jacob, do you want to tell us about, you don't need to recap everything in there, but just outline. This is one of the more summary version. We move from the myth beautifully told to a more summary set of information.
Right. So this is just, Tolkien's kind of brief overview of kind of the ruling powers of this world that he's created. So Arda, and there's different, so you get into the universe itself is created, and then within the universe, there's this world, which is referred to as Arda, which, this is equivalent to Earth, what we're on right now. And then, so there's a number of these powers that we mentioned at the beginning. Several of them choose to come down and be tied to this world, and that their kind of fates, their fortunes, sorrows, and everything are all tied up in what's happening in this world, in this particular world within the larger universe. And so this is Tolkien kind of outlining what is the pantheon, and so you have pairs of gods, often male and female pairs. And some of which
are brothers. It's not just that's where I think where it feels quite Norse. So Melkor is paired, like coeval, I think is the word used, with Manwe, who's like the Odin or Zeus, or the sort of top good guy.
Right.
Not that Odin's good, but you know what I mean. He's like the top of that side.
So some of them have like specific, or said, they're brothers to this one. Some are, wedded to other gods. So you have, hints of the like Norse, Greek pantheons there. And then there's 14 that are kind of functioning. There were 15 with Melkor, who is the chaotic, our trumpeter soloist extraordinaire. He is kind of falls outside, kind of takes things over, and there's a separation between the two. So so this there are different kind of categories, different areas of the world that they kind of have responsibility for. So you mentioned Manwe, who's kind of the head chief of this, that has seems to have a particularly special relationship with Iluvatar, the primary overarching god. But it's largely this overarching god kind of leaves everything up to these powers, these kind of lower orders of beings, compared to the god Iluvatar, and each of them is responsible for developing some part of creation itself. So, for instance, so you have Aule, who's kind of the craftsman god. Construction, who's tied to like rock. You have Ulmo, who's the god of the water, and song as well. So there's differences. One of the things that I think is a mistake to really do is to try to identify directly this god of Tolkien is equivalent to Poseidon. So Ulmo has some similarities with Poseidon or Neptune, but there are differences in that. Ulmo is really is a solitary figure, right? So Poseidon, so Ulmo is solitary, doesn't take a wife, and oftentimes functions outside of the rest of the pantheon, kind of does his own thing, has a special relationship with elves and humans, and he also is really enamored with song. And so you see that the song of the Ainur, it said, is the analogy that you used, Julia, about waves, about creation kind of happening in waves. Tolkien says in this that the music of the Ainur kind of is echoed in the music of the sea, right? The sound of the sea.
I wrote that down because I thought it was so beautiful. I wrote it down today. Let me read it to you. And it is said by the Eldar that in water there lives yet the echo of the music of the Ainur, more than in any substance else that is in the earth. And many of the children of Iluvatar hearken still unsated to the voices of the sea, and yet know not for what they listen. Which is why there's a link here, of course, if you're looking for your Lord of the Rings links, to why it's so dangerous for Legolas to hear the sea. And he doesn't know why, but he's listening to the music of the Ainur. So that's, I love those little moments where you think, oh, right, that's what that's all about. Yeah.
And that's right. The reading, one of the big things, I think, a reason for encouraging audience members to pick up the Silmarillion is it enhances. If you like Lord of the Rings, this will only enhance your reread of Lord of the Rings. So you pick up on different things that are laying behind this that Tolkien doesn't spell out specifically, but this is, like we mentioned, the soil from which Lord of the Rings is growing. So everything that you read here is going to only heighten your appreciation for understanding of what's happening in Lord of the Rings.
Absolutely. So beneath the Valar is like none of these words quite work, but archangels or something, angelic beings or beings of power, who are called the Maya. And here we got another wonderful little clue. Do you want to just run through who the Valar are? The Maya are.
Maya, yeah. So they're So within these, so the Ainur, we said, right, the Ainu Lindale, the music of the Ainur. Ainur are all of these beings of power that God, that Iluvatar creates, and within that group, there's higher and lower beings. The higher ones are the Valar, these that we kind of were saying are function similar in somewhat similar ways to, like, pantheons, Norse, Greco-Roman pantheons. But then the Maiar are beings of lesser power sometimes, but they all have a lot of them have specific purposes in different ways, and often align themselves with some of the Valar. So they might be, apprentices too. So for instance, one of the Valar that I find most fascinating, that you don't really have an equivalent for in other world pantheons, is Nienna, who's the goddess of sorrow, of pity, sorrow, and wisdom. And so talking about these Maiar, so it said that Olorin, who is one of these Maiar, these lesser
Another
beings.
quote I've written down. Let's have it. So, wisest of the Maya was Olorin. He too dwelt in Lorien. That's Lorien over in the west, not the one in the east. But his ways took him often to the house of Nienna, and of her he learned pity and patience. So, are you going to do the big reveal? Who is Olorin?
Lauren, we're told later that that's Gandalf, right? So that's a Maiar a Maya who chose to put on flesh and to have his fate tied directly and among the people of Middle Earth, and the elves, humans, dwarves. So every time, so this again, so like reading this, that's one of the biggest things that it did for me, was opened up this different avenue that then I saw what Gandalf is doing in Lord of the Rings in a completely different way. So he is an apprentice to this goddess of weeping and wisdom. And so and her music is also featured in the Ainulindale, the creation, where there's this kind of overarching sorrow that kind of weaves its way in creation, but it's a sorrow that is generative. It's not kind of a depressing sorrow, but it's a sorrow that is leading ultimately to wisdom and good in the end. And so that's what Gandalf is doing here, is kind of a emissary, if you will, for this goddess Nienna, a disciple of Nienna. And that's why when he talks about pity to Frodo, right, about Gollum, that's coming from his experience and training with this goddess of pity and sorrow and wisdom. And because sorrow and wisdom kind of come hand in hand from the perspective of that goddess. That's kind of her thing, is how sorrow can be generative of wisdom. And so you'll see, so if you read the Silmarillion, if you haven't to this point, and if you don't get anything else but just looking at these gods and following this goddess of weeping, and she does a number of other things with the gods that are really interesting and important for the world itself, and the lights that's tied to the Silmarils and the Silmarillion proper that we'll talk about. But if you get nothing else like that, just following that thread with the Maiar, this lesser being of power, Olorin, who then takes on flesh and becomes Gandalf, and understanding that alone, I think, can help change and deepen your reading of Lord of the Rings all the way through, and Hobbit for that matter.
Yeah, and there's 3 more. I mean, because we could spend
Go forever. Yeah.
talking about this.
It's a thick book.
Yeah. So there's 3 more Maya to highlight. One is Sauron is also a Maya. So he is, that's where a lot of his power comes from. And so are the Balrogs. So when Gandalf says, he's really shocked when he finds a Balrog, most of them are supposed to have been destroyed at the end of the first age. He knows he says something about it's not a foe that you can match. He knows it's on his level rather than on their level. And then the last one is a Maya called Melian, who is very, very important in the first stage. So let's move now to the Quinta Silmarillion. Now, we obviously can't cover this, but just reading it, you'll find when you look at the table of contents that it breaks down into quite readable sections. It's very well divided up. The first part of it is the story of how it's basically the story of how the world is lit. It might sound strange, but it starts with the trees. So if you've been watching the Rings of Power, they mention the trees briefly. And if you were confused by that, you can find the explanation in the Silmarillion. And these beautiful trees are destroyed. This is me really rapidly going forward. Really, they're destroyed by Melkor, who has with him an enormous spider. What's the name of the spider? Forget her name.
Ungoliant.
There you are. Who Shelob is a descendant of. And so she has this voracious appetite, and so she sort of chomps down all the light. And the only light that is left is captured in some jewels, which were made by an elven smith called Fëanor. Fëanor? Where do you put it? Fëanor. Yeah, I'm never quite sure about the emphasis there. It's over the Fëanor. But he has a sickness of craftsmanship, really, which is a recurrent problem in this world. He doesn't want to let go. And so when these jewels are taken by Morgoth, who runs off with them, he decides he won't share the light. He wants to go and get them back for himself. But he sets it up like a crusade. And this divides the elves. I've skipped over the fact that the elves have been created. I'm really sorry, but we haven't got time. The elves were created, invited to go and live over in the west. I should have said that. Anyway, so Fëanor and his supporters set off to regain the Silmarils, and that's the big, big, big driver of the first stage. Now, I think it's helpful just to point out the family trees here. So we've got Fëanor, who the parent of Fëanor is somebody called Finwë and his wife, I think Miriel. They have 3 sons. Correct me if I get this wrong.
Right. Yeah. 3 sons.
Fëanor
total.
He has a whole range of sons under him who are like his sort of supporters, like his clan. And then his brothers, this is where it gets interesting because we all meet lots of characters that you recognize. In fact, there's a helpful family tree in the back of the, if I can show that, if you're watching. His brothers are Fingolfin, half brothers, in fact, and Finarfin. And in the Fingolfin family line is Gil-galad, who is the king that you see in Rings of Power, and ending up at Elrond and Elros. So that's that bit. And then Finarfin, one of his children is Galadriel, and her brother, she has a number of brothers, but her brother Finrod is the one that I think you saw at the beginning of the Rings of Power. So it's quite a tight family group. And just to point out here, Galadriel is very old. She is one of these Noldor, that's the name of that group, and she's one of the elves who goes on the crusade. But importantly, she isn't responsible for the next big thing that happens, which perhaps you could take over, Jacob, and tell us about the evil amongst the elves.
Yeah, so Feanor is kind of driving this. He's the one that created the Silmarils, these gems that captured the light of the trees of Valinor that were now destroyed. So this is the last of those. They're supposed to be the most beautiful things ever created within this worth within Arda. So when they're stolen by Melkor, he makes an oath, and his children make an oath that they will not rest until they retrieve those. And so and anyone that they will slay anyone who holds, touches, holds, keeps these that doesn't return it directly to them. And so you have them, again, this is they're willing to do this by any means necessary, even at the cost of the lives of their kindred. So there's this one tragic event where they go to get ships to try to sail across the ocean to go back into the east, which again, like Julia said, they're in the west with the gods to sail east. They don't have ships. They come to their kindred who do have ships and end up asking them to say like, hey, we need your ships to go do this, and they didn't want to part with their ships, and so they slaughtered their kin, took the ships, sailed over, and then also burned the ships, and kind of had insult to injury. So that's kind of where you have this idea of sundering. So this is kind of almost, again, to make loose connections, kind of Cain and Abel moment, where you have the kindreds separating themselves and kind of the first schisms between the elves as a whole, whereas before they were kind of functioning more or less in harmony or kind of doing their own things or finding their own places. Here's where they start to really come into conflict, and it just continues as long as the Silmarils are around, which is through the rest of this first age on. And so this is kind of a series of stories about essentially this is what drives the conflict within the Quinta Silmarillion, is the children of Feanor and the children of Feanor trying to get the Silmarils back among all, and which are part of this history of all these elves, and then men come into the picture eventually, and which brings them into conflict with this kind of oath of Feanor and his children to get the Silmarils back.
Yeah, so in case you're worried that Galadriel is guilty of kinslaying, it's only the sons of Fëanor and Fëanor himself who are part of the kinslaying. And they don't even have enough boats. And so he's a nasty bit of work, this guy.
Right.
He gets in the boat and sails off, leaving his allies who've also sworn this oath. Some people turn back at that point, but the rest of the Noldor, including Galadriel and including Gil-galad's father and all sorts of people, they all carry on.
Right.
But they have to go across the northern, like the ice passage across the north. So, the equivalent of Alaska. They have to go over that bit.
There's a beautiful name. Is it the Hel Caraxa? It's the land of grinding ice. So this is just
And many of the elves die at that time. So they obviously arrive in Middle-earth, still bound by this oath, but not very pleased, obviously, horrified by the actions of Fëanor and children. And they're also under a doom, so a curse. The Valar say that you've chosen that, you can't come back. So one of the, just to do a link forward to the Rings of Power series, one of the things they've not followed through is that Galadriel, as one of the Noldor, is under a particular doom that she can't go back to the west. Other elves could. So all that stuff about you've been given a special ticket back, that's not right in terms of the Tolkien story. And in fact, her journey isn't completed until she resists the power of the ring later on. It's like one moment where finally she can go into the West. So that story arc is beautifully described. You can pick it out of the Silmarillion. So you might want to delete that bit from your memory of the Rings of Power, because it doesn't quite work with Galadriel's story. It's a better story that Tolkien's come up with. Okay, so we can't go into every single story here, but what we do get is a collection of quite often pairs. So brothers and sisters. There's a lot of tragic stories, brothers and sisters, love story. And of course, one of the stories that we can't overlook is the marvelous love story of Beren and Luthien. Jacob, do you want to tell us a little bit about the importance of this story in the sort of Tolkien mythos?
Right. So Beren and Luthien are the story of a human who falls in love with and ends up marrying an elf maiden. And this is a story. This is probably the most, I think, the closest, perhaps, in kind of tone and pacing to what you see in Lord of the Rings. So you can read you can pick up the story of Beren and Luthien and read it through, and I think it's very readable and engaging. And it's this wild adventure with a hero and heroine. The heroine saves the hero several different times. There's battles.
A talking
Luthien
dog?
fights.
Is a talking
Yeah,
dog?
there's a dog who can only talk 3 times, and so he has to use his words carefully. And then they fight Sauron. So you have a confrontation where just Luthien fights Sauron, and it's anyway
Is it Sauron or is it Morgoth?
She puts Morgoth. So I think she fights Sauron. She puts Morgoth to sleep. So anyway,
Okay.
so there's kind of you have kind of a almost reverse Orpheus and Eurydice story happening here. And so their task ultimately, so there's something to do with them again, which said Melkor stole the Silmarils, right, and has them in a crown. And so these two brave Angband and the hosts of Morgoth to go take one of these back to Luthien's father so that he can have her hand in marriage. So quite a task. Anyway, so it's this story of, and there's sorrow, I don't want to spoil anything for people who haven't read it yet, but there's changing of sorrows. There's eucatastrophes, right? These moments of unexpected joy and surprise in the face of defeat and sorrow. And ultimately, so this kind of becomes a paradigm for the uniting of different peoples, right? Humans, elves, of the worldly with the kind of like higher or artistic, beautiful. And this story of elves and men kind of uniting gets recapitulated time and again, even unto, right? So we have in Lord of the Rings, Aragorn and Arwen, their love. We see Aragorn singing parts of this song, of this story in Lord of the Rings. So if you want that kind of the full story of what happens here and why Aragorn would be singing this and identify so much with Beren and Luthien. So we have that in Lord of the Rings, but then even Tolkien carrying over into his own life, this is kind of inspired by his relationship with his wife. And so this story is recapitulated. He's seeing, echoes. We're seeing echoes of Tolkien's life in Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien sees echoes of Lord of the of this, in the Silmarillion, the story of Beren of Luthien, sees echoes of this in his own life, going the opposite direction. So much so that when his wife dies, he has Luthien carved on her headstone, and then after he dies, then Beren is inscribed on his tombstone. So he saw himself as, in essence, kind of part of this recapitulating story of the bringing together of two people, one person who seems to be like an ordinary Joe, ordinary guy, then like marrying up, finding a woman who is clearly beyond him and who enriches his life in myriad ways. And so that story you see kind of popping up in waves, kind of coming up over and over within Tolkien's broader legendarium.
Yes, it's told it's not it's told in quite a length in this book, but also there's a separate volume, even longer version of this Beren and Luthien story, which you can get separately. But this is a good place to start if you want to read that story. So perhaps the last place in the first age we should pay attention to is a fabulous section, which I think I just reread it for doing this podcast and realized how brilliant it is. It's actually one of my favorite bits in the Silmarillion now, and that's the Voyage of Arendelle. Now, we won't go into all the family backgrounds, but perhaps listeners will want to know that Arendelle is the father of your favorite elf lord, Elrond. So he's and he is absolutely key to how the first age ends. So I think if I was looking for a place to, someone said I want to read something in the Silmarillion that has sort of a big battle in it and lots of sort of scope, I think this is a fantastic story because it also includes the sort of mythic element of a voyage to the west and becoming a star and all sorts of wonderful things. Plus his wife is, very active, and it's all great stuff. So the Voyage of Arendelle ends the first age because he successfully crosses the sea with one of the, has he got one of the Silmarils with him? She brings him a Silmaril. His wife brings him a Silmaril, doesn't she? Yes, I think that's right. And so they get to the other side where they're not supposed to go, but they appeal to the Valar to come and save Middle-earth from the evil Melkor. And there's a big battle. I'm not going to spoil the detail. Just read it because it's fantastic. It's, everybody comes and helps. And this is when the geography changes, because as a result of literally locking down this original bad guy, this power, there's huge sort of geological upheaval. And that's when the old map transforms into the more familiar map of Middle-earth. And so that's the end of the first age. And that's the point where we're going to stop for this podcast. And we're going to pick up at the second age and the Ancalabeth in our next episode.